Good afternoon in Dalian. I think it's still sunny outside, if I remember. Also, good afternoon from Dalian to those of you who are watching us online. A warm welcome to a session entitled Cooperation in a Competitive World. I'm Mirek Dušek. I'm Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and I'll be steering this discussion over the coming hour. If I look at the theme of this session, it's really cutting to the essence of the proceedings here. If I were to exaggerate a little bit, you could really go back to Dickens and could say, we're living in the worst of times and the best of times, okay? So again, slight exaggeration, but of course people are tracking the upswing of geopolitics in terms of how it has become more material to international relations, but also to the conduct of business relations, and it affects really, frankly, everyone wherever they sit in the world. So that's on one hand, the drag of geopolitics, if you will. But on the other hand, you have quite a unique time in terms of the stack of technologies that we see both in the digital economy, but also around the energy transition that could really transform our economy and our society. And if used responsibly and in the right way, they could really bring about more productive, more inclusive, and more sustainable economies. So really, how do you get things done? How do you get, hopefully, positive things done in this more complicated world, a more complicated geopolitical environment is really going to be at the heart of our discussion today. And I'm pleased to be joined for this dialogue by impressive leaders. Let me just mention them and welcome them. Bruce Jones, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution in the US. Bo Lee, Deputy Managing Director, International Monetary Fund, Washington, D.C. Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economy of Malaysia. Muhammad Ali Sis, Minister of Finance of Jordan. Paula Ingabire, Minister of Information, Communication, Technology and Innovation of Rwanda, who is also a young global leader of the World Economic Forum, and on our Board of Trustees. Welcome. And Lin Kuok, last but not least, Lee Kuan Yew Chair in Southeast Asia Studies at the Brookings Institution. So a warm welcome to all of you. So I mentioned the more competitive world, the more competitive landscape. So I'd like to break protocol a little bit, if you don't mind. I'd like to start with our thought leaders to help us map it a little bit to understand what that might mean. So let me start with you, Bruce, if I could. You have done actually a paper for us with some other people recently, and there you say distrust is baked in, or it's a baked-in feature of our geopolitical reality. And so if I take that, and if I say, okay, there is distrust, so at a time of distrust, how can we actually do cooperation? What could it look like? And also, frankly, what could it look like also in the security landscape? Because a lot of people are worried about some of these flashpoints. So is it even possible to do cooperation when there is so much distrust in the system?
Yes. Thank you, Marek, for having us here and for hosting this important panel. This theme runs throughout the discussions, but it's good to bear down directly on it. Look, is this the worst of times? I'm struck by the old American phrase, you ain't seen nothing yet. I mean, look, let's be honest, things can get a lot worse. Let's not pretend that we are at the nadir here by any means. There are serious pressures driving the United States and China towards an intensification of the rivalry, towards an increasingly militarized version of the rivalry, and we have only very weak buffers against that. And I would say if we look at the kind of dynamics in the world today, the sort of centripetal forces that hold us together are slowing, and the centrifugal forces that are kind of pulling us apart are growing in pace. And so I think we're in a very dangerous time. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be all doom and gloom and give up. I would think we have to do two very important things. One, we have to double down on diplomacy. We saw some positive steps in San Francisco with Biden and Xi, kind of renewing military communication, sort of renewing bilateral diplomacy. We're going to need that in spades. The more tense things become, the more diplomacy we need. Sometimes this gets portrayed to the opposite. Oh, it's tense, we can't have diplomacy. No, it's the exact opposite. The more difficult things become, the more diplomacy we need to try to hold the floor and keep some sort of crisis management mechanisms in place. Second thing we have to do, I think, is to realize that we have long experience. It's in the past, but we have long experience of what it means to do things jointly, even if we don't really trust one another. And that was in the theme of the paper that Lynn and I and others wrote for you earlier in the year, that you can, I steal the phrase from Reagan and I twist it a little bit. Reagan said, just, trust but verify. My phrase for the current moment is, just accept that there's distrust, but distrust but collaborate, right? We don't trust one another. That doesn't mean we can't work jointly on climate change. It doesn't mean we can't work jointly on infectious disease. It can't mean we can work on non-proliferation. And you can look back to the most difficult moments, for example, between the United States and the Soviet Union at the absolute peak of the Cold War. And we were still collaborating with the Soviet Union on infectious disease, on geophysics, on environmental questions. You don't have to trust one another to have that kind of, recognition that there are problems that we both have to work on to try to solve. So I think we shouldn't be romantic and think that collaboration requires a degree of trust, as if it doesn't. We also have to be realistic that economic interdependence is not a barrier to conflict, never has been, and it's not going to be now. So we have to invest in the direct diplomacy of managing this very consequential relations, both at the bilateral level. I think the major emerging powers have roles to play in sort of buffering that diplomacy, adding third-party voices, adding costs to the United States and China if they kind of escalate their tensions. And frankly, the Global South has leverage on this too, maybe for the first time in the modern period. Both the Chinese and the Americans and the Russians and the Europeans all want things from the Global South. That gives them leverage. What they don't want is the United States and China to tear down the trade system as they kind of fight over things. And I think that that's going to be an important factor in at least raising the cost in the United States and China of continuing to escalate tensions.
Thank you. If I could just follow up. So you mentioned some examples from the Cold War that we used to have between the Soviet Union and the United States. It used to be called the bipolar world. Now people describe this world as a multipolar world. They recognize maybe the supremacy or the leadership position of the G2, if you will, but what about Russia? So it is more complicated. We have more powers in the system, and obviously there is a war in Europe, in Ukraine, and so how does that fit in? How do we have some mechanisms to manage global security at a time when we have other powers, and some of them having certain actions that lead to war? How does that come into the equation? Because you mentioned some mechanisms bilateral, which is good, but how do we manage it in a multipolar system?
Yeah, so I think that both the phrase bipolarity and the phrase multipolarity are inaccurate to describe the contemporary reality, right? If you think about which powers can shape global affairs in every walk of life, there are two. There's the United States, and to a lesser degree, there's China. No other actor can shape world affairs to the same degree in every region and every walk of life. But then you have Europe and Russia and India and Japan and a number of other players who are very strong and have considerable capabilities who matter to one realm or the other. Russia doesn't really matter much in certain aspects of the economy, but it obviously matters in nuclear weapons and in European security and vice versa, right? You can sort of look across that. And so that gets complex at the one hand. But as I said, I think it's a net advantage in the sense that you've got very consequential actors, the Indians, the Japanese, the European Union, et cetera, who do not have an interest in seeing a direct clash between the United States and China. Now, Russia is a kind of very unique problem, and it's going to have to be handled in the kinds of terms we're dealing with it now. But the rest of the actors, I think, do have a stake in some degree of stability, even if they have their interests in managing the disequilibriums and et cetera. So that sort of second tier of power, in my mind, if it's correctly handled and correctly understood, is actually constructive towards stability, not the opposite, with the big exception of Russia. So multipolarity isn't exactly right, but this kind of diffused power in different domains is just a reality we're going to grapple with. And then there's this other layer of action, which, quite a lot of countries in the world, maybe 60, 70 countries, who have a degree of diplomatic and market power that's unlike what we dealt with in the Cold War. And that's net positive in my mind in terms of the ability of people to limit the way that the Americans or the Chinese or others kind of complicate their lives, the ability to extract sort of better deals through the competition between the Americans and the Chinese. We talked yesterday with Robin about the Global South sort of being a place where both the Chinese and the Americans should compete to help move people up the global supply chain. That would be a net positive. So there are multiple layers of power here. We're going to have to manage them all simultaneously. Obviously, the United States and China have more power than everybody else to tear things down. The Russians are doing a pretty good job. And then lots of other powers who have a more constructive view on world politics, as I say, and we really have to rely heavily on those actors.
Thank you. Can I just, one more thing very quickly, I know you've done a lot of work on multilateralism, because, forgive me, but it used to be the UN Security Council that was kind of the body which would deal with security issues. So is it relevant still? Because you also mentioned other powers now that are not there. And if not, then do we have mechanisms? What are the mechanisms to actually have a certain body that would help us deal with this new composition of power globally?
So I'd make two quick points here. One, I think when people look at the Security Council, they tend to focus on the way the Security Council has worked in the last 30, 35 years, which, if we're just frank about this, has basically been an instrument by which the West has projected mechanisms into the Global South. That's not what we need the Security Council for now. What we need the Security Council for now is the way it was used during the Cold War, which is a vehicle where the powers themselves can meet and de-escalate tensions between them. That's how the Americans and the Soviets used it during the Cold War. The Council was a place where the top powers could find solutions to budding crises or put third-party mechanisms in place to stop escalation. We need to return to that. It's never operated in isolation. It's always operated in tandem with sort of creative middle power and third-party diplomacy. The Argentinians, the Canadians, the Koreans, the Poles, et cetera. You need that second tier of power who have an interest in stability to help animate solutions through bodies like the Council, could be the G20, et cetera. But it's that combination, middle power diplomacy and the willingness of the top powers to be pulled towards deconfliction that can help us navigate through.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Moving to you, Lynn Kuok. You have spent a lot of time focusing on Southeast Asia, the geopolitical and the security picture there. If you were to kind of react to Bruce and maybe take that assumption that we've discussed, there's more distrust, what does it mean for Southeast Asia kind of security and geopolitical relations?
Well, I think Southeast Asia obviously has been very much squeezed, and I think you would hear that from the minister from Malaysia as well. Southeast Asia has been squeezed by great power competition, and you hear also very often how they don't want to choose, and I think in this respect it's no different from countries in, say, Europe or even in the Middle East, where they don't want to have to choose between the United States and China. Now, I think not having to choose between two powers isn't the same thing as not having to be for something. And I think, very often, or rather too often, I find countries both within Southeast Asia as well as outside Southeast Asia say that they don't want to choose between the two powers, and then using that as a sort of sidestepping or an excuse not to stand out more firmly or strongly on the rule of law. And you asked me how Southeast Asia has been responding in this particular context, and I think it's done three things. One is that it's sought to cooperate more within its own bloc, so within Southeast Asia. Southeast Asian countries have sought to work more bilaterally with each other, minilaterally with each other, or within the Association for Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. So that's one. Number two, the importance of middle powers, which Bruce mentioned, has come really very much to the forefront of Southeast Asian relations. So in order to hedge against the uncertainties of US-China rivalry, Southeast Asian countries have sought to reach out more to middle powers like Japan, Europe, etc. And in this respect, I think we've seen European countries and the EU fare the best in annual polls, followed by Japan. So the region is very much looking towards these areas or countries to hedge against uncertainties of great power competition. And third, it's sought to rely more heavily on the rule of law. And so they've sought to talk about how the rule of law is really important. And I think this helps to, in a sense, shield them against incursions into their sovereignty as well as sovereign rights. It also helps to provide a degree of protection against economic coercion. And third, it also, I think, helps them in their ability to, as I mentioned earlier, not to frame it about their choice as being about the US or China, but really about being for the rule of law and against the rule of the jungle. And so that, I think, is what Southeast Asian countries have sought to do. Bruce talked about the sort of guardrails that helped with current tensions. And I think I would add, of course, the rule of law to it, but also my concerns about the increasing gray zone activities in my part of the world, which are stressing the rule of law. It's also stressing communications that need to take place between countries, putting a greater degree of emphasis on them. So with greater gray zone operations in the region, we need to try to de-escalate that, and the means by which one does that is, of course, having countries, great powers, talk to each other. But if that isn't happening and gray zone operations are increasing within the region, then we have greater risk of war. So I think, in this respect, what's happening in Southeast Asia with the Philippines and China, I think, is of great concern, because although it might seem quite small in the grand scheme of things, skirmishes at sea, etc., they can really escalate by drawing in the United States, by triggering the mutual defense treaty between the Philippines and the United States. So I would watch for that if one were concerned about things.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Bruce, for helping us kind of lay the land a little bit of the more competitive environment. If I could move to Bolli, Deputy Managing Director at the IMF. So if I could ask you a little bit about kind of the overall economic architecture that we have, particularly around trade. Trade used to be the engine of global growth. Now it's actually slower than the overall GDP growth. Do you think, and it's just one symptom, we could talk about the other symptoms of some of the greater rivalries that we're seeing, but how concerned are you? I know, of course, you're coming here from the IMF, but you must be tracking things in terms of how this more competitive world is weighing on the economy. We know Kristalina Georgieva, I think, spoke about it at the spring meetings. She said that if we don't find new sources of growth, we could be looking back at this decade as the tepid 20s. And of course, the geopolitical risk is mentioned a lot among the factors. So if you can come in on that, I have then one more thing for you.
Thank you. We think we should all be concerned about the rapid rise of trade restrictions in the last several years. Our data shows that in 2023, last year, there were 3,000 trade restrictions imposed by countries. That was more than triple what we had in 2019. Just give you another number. In the same year, 2023, countries also introduced 2,600 industrial policy measures, and 70% of those measures were also trade distorting, which covers at least 1/5 of the world trade. So I think as many of us, as beneficiary of globalization, we should also be concerned that there's such rapid rise in trade restrictions. So in terms of economics, trade restrictions are just bad policy. It's bad for growth, bad for jobs, bad for consumers, bad also for green transition. Our analysis shows that trade fragmentation alone could cause the global GDP loss up to 7%. That's $7.4 trillion a year. That's a combined GDP of France and Germany. And not to mention, if we have, in addition to trade fragmentation, if we also have technology decoupling and also investment fragmentation, the total cost could be as high as 10% of global GDP. So how can we deal with this rise in trade restrictions and protectionism? We think it is very important to continue to uphold the open and rules-based trade system of the world, and it is very important for growth and stability. And of course, such a system is represented by WTO. So we should urge countries to continue to play within the framework of WTO and also try to revive and strengthen WTO, because we know that some part of WTO was not working in the last several years. For example, its dispute resolution system was not working. And let's try to revive that. And also WTO could be a framework where we could, countries could negotiate a, stronger and strengthened industrial policy and industrial subsidy international standards. And also be practical in the sense that, of course, the first best is multilateralism. But if multilateralism does not work, we could also start with what we call plurilateralism. We can start with a group of countries that are willing to sit down and talk about trade rules and how to solve differences in a peaceful, negotiating manner. And of course, I also like what Bruce said about, even though there is a lack of trust, we could still work on some of the common challenges for humanity, such as climate, such as poverty, such as debt issues for developing countries. And we are working together, actually. If you look at the last several years, countries from the West and countries from the East, countries from the North and from the South, we are working together on some of these issues. Multilateral institutions like the IMF, we are still working, and we still can gather countries from different parts to work together. For example, let me give you a very simple example, which was a new facility that IMF introduced, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It's like a new climate fund established by IMF. And I can tell you, this RST, Resilience and Sustainability Trust, we have investors from all over the world, including advanced economies, but also developing countries and emerging markets. They are all investing in this trust. And this trust is used to support developing countries and low-income countries and also vulnerable middle-income countries to tackle with climate change. And this is an example showing that we could still work together as a globe if we have the right leadership, if we have the right platform. And finally, before I conclude, which is the fact that we should not pretend trade can benefit everybody at the same time. We know some group may be vulnerable to trade, and that is why we also support countries to introduce policy to support vulnerable groups that could be negatively impacted by trade, at least in the short term. And if the country have the right policy that supports them, these people can eventually benefit from free trade. I stop here.
Thank you. If I could just go to one more thing, maybe just for a quick reaction. Obviously, and you mentioned it actually as the thing we could work on together. In the world, climate change, obviously, this is a common challenge. I know the IMF is working on that a lot. Climate financing is something that is of huge importance. You could say that really this complicated geopolitical picture could really not again come at a worse time, frankly, because we need to get more capital into developing countries, emerging markets, to help really the globe overall to get to the goals that we set for ourselves. What is it? We talk about practical ways to get to things despite. So what are the things you're working on or you would point to in terms of really making sure that we can live up to that ambition?
Thank you for that. Well, I think climate is a good place where we could look for more international cooperation. I just attended a panel earlier today on carbon pricing, where I talk about the three-pronged approach to tackle climate change. The first prong is carbon pricing. The second prong is climate finance. And the third is technology, innovation, and diffusion. And in all three areas, we need strengthened international cooperation. Let me use the example of climate finance. We have estimated that by 2030, we need $5 trillion a year globally for mitigation alone. And we had only $900 billion in 2020. So in 10 years, we have to grow that from $900 billion to $5 trillion. And among that $5 trillion, emerging market and developing countries need $2 trillion a year. And most of these $2 trillion have to come from private sector, from the international private sector. And so far, what we have seen is very small compared to the scale of demand. So there is a huge gap. So how to tackle that gap? And we all know that for emerging market and developing countries, climate investment can be very challenging. There are many barriers for private sector to go in to a developing country or emerging market to invest in, for example, low carbon technology or renewables. And I summarize those challenges in three aspects. First one is there is a lack of policy predictability in developing countries. Second, there's a lack of capacity. Because of lack of capacity, there's a lack of a pipeline of bankable projects. There's a lack of implementation capacity, etc. That's the second lack. The third lack is a lack of risk mitigation, because there are many risks associated with investing in developing countries and emerging markets, such as FX risk, such as sovereign default risk. Because of these three lack of policy predictability, lack of capacity, and lack of risk mitigation, there is obviously very hard for private sector to go in, right? So what can we do? I think we can do public sector and the international public sector can work together to try to tackle these barriers to investment. In terms of policy, international community should support policy reform in these countries to support, for example, carbon pricing, to support green budgeting. In terms of capacity, of course, international community could also work together to help developing countries, emerging markets to build capacity, to have a pipeline of projects, to have the capacity to implement projects. And finally, in terms of risk mitigation, public sector could take more risk to help at least partially de-risk for private sector to come in. For example, public sector could come up with more equity because there is a shortage of equity in this country. There is too much debt, not enough equity. For another example, multilateral development banks, MDBs, and IFIs could play a bigger role in de-risking. And in order to play a bigger role, these institutions also need to reform. The big shareholders, of course, are advanced economies. The big shareholders of MDBs and IFIs are advanced economies. They have to come together to say that we can increase capital for these multilateral institutions. We can allow these multilateral institutions to take more risk, to help de-risk for the private sector. This requires reform, and this requires international collaboration. And before I conclude, I can tell you that at least World Bank and IMF were working hard to try to strengthen that collaboration. Actually, just last month, we announced a strengthened collaborative framework between World Bank and IMF in terms of climate action. We're going to try to have to jointly support policy reform in developing countries, to jointly support the scale up of climate finance, and also to provide complementary technical assistance to help developing countries to develop a capacity in terms of project preparation and project implementation. I stop here.
Thank you. Can I just, one quick thing, because I know there's a lot of momentum now within the World Bank Group on guarantees. So are you saying that more should be done, or is this part of what you said, that we are seeing now that there is MIGA and others are pooling resources to do more de-risking through guarantees? Or is it more?
That's my understanding too. I think the World Bank is consolidating its guarantee platforms into a single platform, and as such, it could be more powerful in providing guarantees.
Thank you so much. I'd like to move to Paula Ingabire, Minister of ICT of Rwanda, but you also are part of our global efforts around AI. So number one, advanced technologies are very important. You've been really a thought leader and leader on that in Rwanda, in Africa. But if I could just get first your global perspective on AI, because we're here to talk about kind of how do you get things done in a more competitive environment. And so if you could just give me your reaction on, there is a lot of efforts now to figure out how do you at least coordinate on AI a little better among nations, possibly also including some companies that have some of these models. So how confident are you that we can get to some more visibility on some of these models? We will have the Digital Compact coming up in September. There is a UN panel set up for that. Do you think that we will see in some near-term horizon some new mechanisms to help us actually get some international guardrails on AI, or is it more that we still don't know?
I think there's already a lot of effort that, gives us a bit of confidence that we'll see essentially a bit of convergence. I think the key question is, are there multiple platforms where we are talking about global governance for AI? And what is the danger of having siloed conversations where we may end up with multiple, frameworks on how we govern AI as a technology? And so I think there's a lot of excitement on the potential of AI. There's obviously concerns around the risks that come with the technology. But what we need to see more, and I think this is what the forum is doing very well, is how do we then bring the multiple conversations that are happening in such a way that they are representative of the different voices, both east, west, north, south, in making sure that when we come up with these governance frameworks, at least we're catering to the unique nuances and needs that each of these groups may already have. And for Rwanda, the choice to leverage frontier technologies really is a question, or it's a matter of necessity. It's a question of survival, because we have a long history in how we're building the right capabilities, the infrastructure, because for us this is really a growth driver for our country. But when it comes to how do we balance between the need to innovate fast and responsibly, and the need to ensure that we're taking care of the risks and putting in place the necessary safeguards, I think that the answer is partly in the way you framed your question, which is global collaboration that is required. And collaboration has multiple layers. There is collaboration between policymakers and government actors, because what you want is not siloed legislation that makes it difficult to scale the different AI models and solutions that are being put out, especially because we're thinking about open sourcing many of these models. But there's also collaboration that comes from, can we have policymakers having a conversation with the developers of these AI models, because what you don't want is a huge disconnect between the regulations, the standards, the policies that are being put in place, and the rate at which we are seeing the AI models being developed. Because in the end, if one is faster than the other, then adoption is going to be slowed down in a way, but also many of the risks that we're all concerned about are going to really play out essentially. The second thing is conducting thorough risk assessments, because some of the risks are going to play out differently according to geographies and what they have in place. They could also play out differently depending on the domains and sectors. So if you're concerned about privacy, let's say, in the way you're applying AI models to healthcare services, it may be different when we think about agriculture. But again, there will be different nuances, and really doing detailed risk assessments and frameworks that allow us to then make sure that the regulations, the standards, the guidelines we're putting in place are context specific. It's possible that we'll probably not have a one-size-fits-all type of regulation that addresses everything. And a country like Rwanda, when we implemented drones, there was a reason why we went with performance-based regulations, because we understood that if we use drones for life-saving services like healthcare, it will be different from if you're using drones for mining activities. And so really figuring out what those risks are and how they're going to play out. My last point will be on maybe let me talk about something before I come back to the issue of research and development. Around collaboration, what we're seeing is many countries that are coming up with AI safety institutes. And that's primarily a plausible initiative, because everyone is concerned. Yes, we understand the potential, the benefits, but there's also these risks that will play out, and we need to put in place these guardrails. And so essentially what we need to do is, how do we create that network of AI safety institutes, and countries that don't have that in existence, what else do they have that allows for that kind of knowledge sharing to happen? But let me move to my very last point, which is around research and development. In order to bridge that gap, it's the investments that we're putting into R&D that are so critical, that we understand, back to the point around transparency and accountability, understand how AI models are influencing decision or making decision, and then just making sure that that is baked into these guardrails that we're putting in place.
Thank you. Maybe just one quick add-on. You are having a summit in the fall on AI, and it's a summit that is in Rwanda, but it's also for the continent. So help us understand, because I've heard you also speak a lot about we need to make sure that we have scalable approaches to things, particularly scalable for Africa, so also solutions for Africa. Kind of what can we expect in terms of the governance framework on this? Is there going to be, let's say, through the African Union or through the African Continental Free Trade Area or through other mechanisms that you may be setting up? Are there going to be attempts to have certain standardized environment around AI, or is it going to be more organic? What do you expect?
Absolutely. The way we are designing the summit, it's a global summit on AI for Africa. And what we're looking at, we see other regions of the world organizing themselves and sort of figuring out, what makes sense for them and how do they come together. And I think this is a great opportunity for Africa as a continent, even for us to start thinking about what does governance look like, especially because our part of the world is the one where even we still have bigger gaps to fix. Some of the foundational infrastructure is not in place, reliable electricity, compute capacity. We still have siloed data sets along the way. And so just sort of figuring out what is it going to take as we come together, as opposed to 54 different countries trying to build their own legislation. The other thing is working with the African Union, which is already underway, putting in place what we are calling an AI continental strategy that allows us to chart the way forward together as a single market. And from that, obviously, what will happen is that for every country within Africa, we'll be able to figure out where does AI create the benefits and opportunities for us. For Rwanda, it could be healthcare. For Togo, it could be mining. For Ghana, it would be something else. But essentially, what we want to make sure is that we are thinking about a single market, and what will work for Rwanda can be scalable in other markets, and what will work in Nigeria can be scalable in other markets of the continent.
Thank you so much. Let me move to Mohamed Issis, Minister of Finance of Jordan. I happen to know your country very well, and I have always been really impressed by the nimbleness of your country faced with a lot of risks and very complicated environments. So if I look at the theme of this session, cooperation in a competitive world, I think you've been in it for a while. It's been something that you've had to navigate for quite some time. But I just wonder, you are the Minister of Finance, so now we have even a more complicated geopolitical picture. At the same time, I know that you've been working very hard on economic reforms, social reforms. So how do you see it? Is it more of the same, or are there added dimensions that are complicating your work as the steward of finances of Jordan?
Thank you, Marek. Reality is the global economic landscape is quite complex. In addition to what the colleagues said about rising protectionism, distrust, we're still reeling from the shocks after shocks we've witnessed, black swans, COVID, Russia-Ukraine, stagflation, higher interest for longer, the brutal war on Gaza, upcoming potential continued conflict in the Middle East with reverberations that are really impacting the whole global economy, disruption of maritime shipping, and with no end in sight. Reality is, as a Minister of Finance, there is very little one can do better than to assume continued uncertainty and to invest in fiscal buffers and to do that before the storms hit. What we've done in Jordan that has proven very successful to us, we have a very successful experience with the IMF, is we designed our own reform program. We didn't wait for the global storms to hit. We invested in reform when we could, and that has built resilience not only among the bilaterals that we have with the IMF and others, but also among the investor community, among rating agencies. Last month we got a sovereign upgrade from Moody's. In the midst of all of that, our spreads at historic low. We're an oasis of stability among a burning region. The danger, Mirek, for a policymaker in the middle of all of that is to keep focusing on survival rather than thriving, to keep focusing on firefighting rather than invest in a very rapidly changing world where you need to equip your human capital for the rise of AI. You need to really focus on the geopolitical shifts that are taking place in the world that I think my colleagues represented very well. But reality is, with everything going on, I worry about our region, which has a young population, about the deficit of hope among the youth, among the radicalization that is going to emerge, whether we like it or not, for everybody in the region witnessing over 40,000 Palestinians being killed before their eyes with very little end in sight, with potential escalation of the conflict. We invest in resilience, but our youth need more than surviving. They dream of a day where they thrive, where they can be a positive contributor to the global economy. And the challenge with these risks that we've been witnessing is that nobody is safe. They don't recognize geographic boundaries. COVID did not stop at borders, nor did stagflation, nor does higher interest rates. Whether we like it or not, the globe is interconnected. You ain't seen nothing yet. And reality is we're still acting as if we can go at it on our own. We come to forums like these where we say all the right things that need to happen. But reality is, as we heard in Davos, the Western world will witness the highest number of elections this year. You have intrastate polarization mixed with interstate protectionism, and the mix is quite concerning. We are surviving, but it takes way, way more from all of us to actually deliver to our youth what they absolutely deserve.
No, thank you. And maybe just, we are in Asia, in China. Help us understand the significance of these economies for Jordan, and do you have more in terms of plans here in this region?
I think what happened in this part of the world is, I'm a development economist. what happened in this part of the world, what happened in China is quite exciting. It's a very successful emancipation of millions upon millions of people from poverty and starvation to actually becoming a positive contributor to the global economy. Having said that, you see the global tension between the US and China. You see the polarized world. And as a politician, it is my job to deliver the best for my people, for the youth. And for that to happen, we need to attract investments. We need to attract technology and science from all parts of the world. And for that to happen, we need to really be ready to adopt this technology. The challenge is, very frankly, as has been said, mistrust is there. Concerns are real. And they can very quickly escalate into something way beyond the current protectionist concerns we have. I agree with you, sir. And what we must recognize is that one size does not fit all. We've seen the failure of the Washington Consensus decades ago, which tried to do that. And I think for countries like China, entering and investments in other countries, for countries like the US and investing in other countries, local context matter, and investing in understanding the local context and really coming with an understanding of the rightful concerns of experiments that we've seen fail in other countries, where countries got entangled with debt in a way that not necessarily was very transparent, is something we have to be cognizant and respectful of in designing these engagements. I'm here today in China because I want to better understand the success that has driven the economy into this growth. But I also want to present a case of, attracting investment to a beacon of stability in the region, which has free trade agreements with the US, with Europe, with the Arab world, sitting right next to the natural resource-rich GCC, that is Jordan, with a ready human capital to be able to be an engine for growth. But reality is, we don't want to get entangled in a bigger discourse that might escalate very quickly in negative ramifications. The future ahead is very complex, with multiple equilibria. Many of them are not necessarily positive, and it's my job as a Minister of Finance to be cognizant of what can go wrong and build buffers against it.
No, thank you so much. Moving back to Asia, last but not least, I'm very happy to go to Rafizi Ramli, Minister of Economic Affairs of Malaysia, a very important economy in this region and globally. The Chinese Premier was visiting your country, I think very recently. It was a 3-day trip. So I think China is Malaysia's main trading partner. At the same time, the United States is a top investment partner. So obviously, you are also navigating this relationship. So I have a few other questions, but if you could at the beginning just to say how do you see that? Is it a dilemma, or is it something that is actually very easy to do and maybe we're overcomplicating things?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's easy to do. Anyone in our position would have to manage something as complicated. But I think common sense always prevails, so long as we maintain constructive engagements. We have differences with practically everyone. I mean, we have differences with Singapore, for that matter. So we do have differences with the US. We have issues with China. But that doesn't stop us from working constructively around the issues, yet at the same time, maintain our belief that trade is very important, especially for the small nations like ours. So I think we have to go back. As a country, we hold true to these two very important philosophies. What is good to the global economy is good for us, because trade is a conduit for capital deployment, for technology deployment, and we've seen how trade has been able to level the playing field for many countries, especially the smaller ones. And the second one, I think we choose to focus on the silver lining, because I think Lin pointed out, as we have to navigate this global position, the G2 between China and the US, there is a sense that, we call ourselves SONA, the small, open, non-aligned nations. There is a sense that we have to emerge above this in order to protect and work together. And the silver lining is I can't agree more with all the other panelists. There is a sense that we have to go back to the international framework that can protect trade, that can provide the mediation, and that can promote this. And so there is a sense of greater cohesiveness in ASEAN. We know that ASEAN is a 700 million market. We need trade. We need to be able to work with everyone. We need the capital and technology deployment. And if we continue to do this, ASEAN needs to work closer with each other. So one example is Singapore and Malaysia. Traditionally has always have the kind of rivalry between the two. We compete. But it was very difficult to get over that competition to work on our synergies. Successive administrations in Singapore and Malaysia always compete about who can do things better. And last year, out of a simple discussion, finally I think the leadership of both countries accept that, hang on, with everything that is happening, let's forget the grandparents' quarrel or competition. We are better off to pitch Singapore and Malaysia to the world because investors can benefit and get the best of both worlds from Singapore and Malaysia. Investors can get the sophistication of Singapore, yet leverage on competitiveness of Malaysia in terms of cost and in terms of resources. And that is the first time in the last, I suppose, 70 years, and we are going to sign a special economic zone between the country. And I think it's the first experiment to show to the 700 million ASEAN market that that is the way to go. We will have to be more cohesive as a region, and Malaysia is going to take over the chairmanship of ASEAN in 2025.
That's right.
And that is definitely a trust, because the silver lining of the geopolitical situation between US and China also mean the SONAs of the world, the Malaysia, Jordan, and the rest, will have to see how do we fit in. And the best way to protect our access to trade is to make sure that we become more cohesive. And I think at the end of the day, we've gone through 100 years of differences, of distrust, of competition. But we also have to accept that the world is so intertwined. And if anything, COVID has shown us that for one gadget that you get, say in the US, you actually have to source different parts in the world. It may come from China, but it starts from Malaysia or Singapore or Jordan. And the global supply chain is very crucial to the whole world. And countries like Malaysia, for example, is a very important component of that global supply chain. And that's why, as much as I think anyone who has to manage either finance or economic portfolios of any small countries, while the job is tricky, is getting very complex, but I think we can be positive and optimistic, because at the end of the day, common sense, I hope, will prevail, so long as we maintain the kind of constructive engagements that have kept the world together all this while.
Hear, hear. Well, that's, let us spread this message around the world, burying the past, looking to the future. So I can say this because I'm an EU citizen, so I can say that I think in the past, you would always hear people say, you know, all these great things about the EU. Now there is a little bit of depression going on, but then a lot of people are saying great things about ASEAN. So you mentioned you are going to have the chairmanship. So if I were to just again push you a little bit, like what is the secret sauce that ASEAN has that you think others could maybe learn from? Why is it going so well in ASEAN?
I feel that ASEAN, for the longest of time, have always navigated this tricky bit, which is we don't really impose on each other, especially when it comes to political and social belief. I mean, there were so many things happening in ASEAN for the last 50 years, here and there, but we focus on economic cooperation. True enough, I think any society, the one thing that any government would want to do is to have the kind of social upliftment. And it all boils down to economic and social progress. And eventually, I think as economies in ASEAN begin to progress and we benefit from the connectivity, from investments from developed worlds and from China, from Japan, our sense of belief in the need to facilitate growth and trade becomes the common factor that binds ASEAN. So that in my generation, it's no longer about lip service of an economic cooperation between ASEAN nations. From 2025 onwards, for example, the focus should be putting on connectivity. And when I say connectivity, it goes beyond bilateral agreements. It is about connecting the grid because we need to promote energy sustainability in that area. And ASEAN has different growth at different stages for different countries. We also have different potentials. The demand for green energy, for example, is in the south. The potential is in the north. It's an archipelago of islands. So the focus is to translate this maxim of cooperation into real connectivity. And one of the key things, for example, that we would focus is connecting all the grids, all the way from Laos through Thailand, to Malaysia, to Singapore, across Borneo. And I think realizing this in actual terms will continue to protect that recipe about ASEAN, which is so long as we focus on uplifting our socio-economic well-being, and that can happen very well if we are connected economically. So we try to avoid the politics and focus on what can improve our society.
Thank you. And maybe just to finish with maybe trying to be a little newsy, I have seen some reporting that maybe you would be joining the BRICS group. Do you have any updates on that? Or?
Well, the announcement was made while I was in China. So I think it goes back to what I said just now about sonars. I mean, we know where we are, our place in the world. We are small, we are non-aligned, but we are very open. And it is part and parcel of emerging economies getting together just to make sure that we are not trapped into everything that is happening. So I think the process has started, and maybe next year we'll be able to give more updates.
Great. Thank you so much. Our time is up, but if I were to just have a takeaway, what I liked is that we are kind of clear-eyed about the threats and the complications out there, but I was hoping before the panel that we would have people really thinking hard about the solutions, and so I take that away. It's quite impressive what you're all doing in your respective domains, and I think the message is clear that we need to find ways to get things done. This is also something that we focus on a lot at the World Economic Forum, different work streams on climate, on AI, on trade, and so I hope that we can pursue that work together. I would like to just, if you could join me to give a round of applause to all the panelists. Thank you so much.